Thanks everyone who's joined so far. We'll start on the dot at 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. It's really nice to see some additional people joining in so well ahead of time. We've just got 1 more minute and then we will start at 2 o'clock. Right, it's 2 o'clock. Welcome everyone. This is Australia's transition to textile circularity at 2025, a 2-part deep dive into current and future states. This is the second part of the CERN APAC theme around textile circularity. Last month, April 2025, was part 1, chaired by Sanyat Islam. Today, we're going to take the conversation further. So very, very happy to be here with everyone. CERN APAC, Circular Economy Research Network Asia Pacific, is a newly formed network of researchers across all things circularity. Today we have a really nice, very interesting set of panelists who will be discussing some textile circularity. Today I'd like to acknowledge the Jirik Ganj people of the Yuin Nation. This is in the Bega Shire, far south coast of Australia. They are the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, that I am meeting on today. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past and present and the next generation of First Nations leaders. I also would like to acknowledge First Nation people from all the lands that we're meeting on today. And I'd like to pay my respects also to all of us who are joining on today, either online or watching the recording. This week is National Reconciliation Week in Australia, and the theme is Bridging Now to Next, with ongoing connection between past, present and future. And what a fitting theme for us to join in this particular session today. Very much the case with the circular economy from this beautiful place that I'm joining you from today, Bega, or the Bega area, which in First Nations in Australia, in this place, has been a traditional meeting place for ceremonies on the far south coast of Australia for many, many, many years, for trading, for sharing of resources, for sharing of materials. And it's been a very powerful place for the national circular economy transition before it was colonised, and also now, because in addition to hosting this very exciting session today, tomorrow we have a whole of community, 140 people across the community and leaders meeting here in this place to talk about how the Bega Valley can become more circular for the future. Also this month, Australia has published, well, just a month ago, Australia has published its No Time to Waste recommendations, and this is at the federal parliamentary level. And the #1 recommendation for that is a Circular Economy Act, which is really interesting. So, good time this week for us to meet, and let's get into our panel. So without further ado, I am so grateful and thankful for our wonderful panelists. We've got 4 panelists today who have helped shape this session and this dialogue. And so we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves. And with that, I will hand over to Professor Alice Payne. Over to you, Alice.
Oh, thanks so much, Colleen. It's marvellous to be here. So my name's Alice Payne. I'm from RMIT University in Melbourne. And by background, I'm a fashion designer and first started teaching fashion design and then became a researcher. And I've worked at UTS, QUT, and now RMIT. So although starting as a designer, I would sum up the purpose of my work as being really seeking to find ways to help shift the fashion and textiles industry towards one that is just and that is life-affirming and that operates within planetary boundaries. And I've worked on this over the past 15 years or so through taking a systems view of fashion. So looking across the entire life cycle of a product, from the cotton field to the mill to factory, design, retail, use, disposal, landfill, and beyond, to find those points of positive intervention, positive change. And I've been able to do that through collaboration with many incredible colleagues from different disciplines and people from many different parts of the industry as well. So I've worked on new technologies to like fibre separation and garment sorting and disassembly techniques. And I've also been fortunate to work in informing industry policy, including helping design Australia's product stewardship scheme, Seamless. What I'll share briefly, though, is we have some projects this year that are very much connected to circularity. We're really pleased to have launched a new circular design guide with colleagues. We're also continuing work around policy, talking to governments around the world about what they're doing to support the sustainable and circular textile value chain. And then I'll just close by saying that in my role at RMIT, I'm Dean of the School of Fashion and Textiles. And in some ways, I think that's probably the most exciting part of the work I do, in that as a school, you know, we have 1,500 fashion students. How do we educate them for the future of the industry that's rapidly shifting? And how do we support them and ourselves transition from the industry that is to the industry that must come? So that's me.
Thank you so much, Alice. And your circular design guide, if you're happy to post a link in the chat that people can access, that would be absolutely marvellous. I'm sure people would be very interested. Over to you, Stephanie. So Stephanie Beaupark is joining us. Over to you.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm not feeling my best today. I've got the flu, so if I lose my voice, that's what's going on. So I am my first and foremost, I am Noogie. So my mob is from Quandamooka country, that's the islands of Brisbane, but I am based down on Darawal country, so that's the background you can see. That's Mount Kira or Gira, and that's where I'm coming from today, right under the mountain, which is a really significant place of learning and teaching. So that's right where University of Wollongong is based. And yeah, so I'm a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and I teach into Indigenous studies, Indigenous science. So I have a very broad area that I teach into. So it's Indigenous art and Indigenous geographies. That's my main subject, Indigenous geographies, and also medicinal chemistry, so Indigenous medicines. And yeah, so my background is I studied both chemistry and visual arts in my undergraduate degree, and now I'm doing my PhD that's combining both of those together. And that is mainly focusing on natural dyes. So natural dyes of Australia, in particular eucalyptus and Australian indigo. And I started out looking at the chemistry of those dyes, and particularly how they interact on fibers. But as my research progressed, I realized how important it was to be listening to the voices of Indigenous artists and people who are working with the dyes and finding ways to bring country and people into the lab in culturally safe ways that isn't extractive like it has always historically been, in taking people's knowledge and knowledge from country and extracting too much of country. So it's bringing in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and thinking about how we approach this work in ways that are slower, more country-centered, and feel authentic, feel culturally authentic and affirming to people. So yeah, I am very cross-disciplinary in my work.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. The University of Wollongong is very generous. They've offered even this space for me down on the far south coast to meet. And yeah, the idea of extraction beyond planetary boundaries also links to the themes that Alice was talking about too. Very interesting concepts that is a challenge for many of us to grapple with. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Over to you, Taylor.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taylor Brydges. I'm a research principal at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. And here I work within the resource stewardship team, where we work with governments, industries, and NGOs to support the transition to circular and sustainable systems of production and consumption. And our focus is really on systemic change. How can we move beyond waste management and linear systems towards stewardship across supply chains? Of course, one area where this is urgently needed is within fashion and textiles. And within our team, we have a dedicated research cluster looking at how to drive environmental and social sustainability in this space. And at the moment, with my colleague Rachel Wakefield-Rand, I'm leading a project funded by the New South Wales EPA's Plastic Research Fund called Testing Toxic Plastics. And this project is investigating the presence of harmful chemical substances in both new and recycled plastic-based textiles, with the specific goal of helping the EPA understand where toxic chemicals enter the plastics economy and how they may actually act as barriers to safe circularity. So here we're looking closely at risks across the textile supply chain, from production to use to recycling, with the aim of informing future regulations, stewardship schemes, and industry best practice. And we hope that the project will ensure, as we expand textile recycling, that we also do so safely without compromising environmental or human health through persistent chemical contamination. Because I think really with recycling receiving a growing share of attention in the circular economy these days, particularly with fashion, we also need to be looking at the potential unintended consequences and blind spots in doing so. I think chemical safety really is a critical one. And this is something as a researcher in sustainable fashion over 15 years now, chemicals feels like it's just kind of come on the agenda. I kind of wonder what we were doing for so long. It's interesting how this is just kind of coming to the forefront now. And I think while chemicals are important, we also need to put this back in context and think about scalability, infrastructure, design, and broader systems of production and consumption that determine the ways we use and also dispose of our clothing in the first place. And I'm really looking forward to contributing to the conversation today, think about where recycling fits into this bigger picture, and share insights from our work on the risks, realities, and opportunities of building a circular system for textiles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And yeah, that recycling part of the circular economy transition seems to be getting a lot of attention, but as we go too fast, maybe we need to also make sure that we're doing it properly within the true intent of circularity, with the principles in mind up front. Thank you. And finally, our final panelist is Tiziana. Over to you.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you for the invitation to be here with all these very interesting people today. And obviously, I know everybody and worked with Alice a lot at QUT and still now. So I'm an educator and researcher at the Queensland University of Technology. And my research combines the investigation of place-based circular economy in local context through the intersection between industry and culture and textile value chains. And my focus here is on wool and how all of these integrates with policy. So I come from a background of working in Italy in unsustainable fashion industry, and as a matter of fact, in international fashion magazines. So those people who very much promote, market and sell clothing to consumers. So at the same time, I've always been involved with the politics in society, then the politics of fashion and justice and equity values. So I have worked in this space at QUT I'm currently the co-lead of the textile group, and I am the program leader of sustainable production and consumption with the QET Centre for Environment and Society. So some of my latest work focused on ESG in procurement of uniforms for the Brisbane City Council. Then we have done a report on the socioeconomic feasibility to the Salvo stores for automated sorting of second-hand clothing, which is the Boomerang project, and I'm sure that everybody knows, which is due to start its first phase in August in Brisbane. And also with the team, we have worked with Ethical Clothing Australia, making a report on ethical labour and industry growth in Queensland, and we focused on procurement as a case study. My current research is expanding in the second-hand clothing, trade and justice. And I've recently returned from the Solomon Island with the team, working also with our film department, where we have conducted field work on the local second-hand trade. So we will be making a documentary, and our aim is to raise awareness on shared responsibility on the export of second-hand clothing by recyclers to the Asia-Pacific region, but also ultimately raise awareness with local consumers about the state of clothing that is being exported. So we have, I suppose, apart from NGO organizations, I think this is the first project of this kind in Australia, and we will be focusing on the Asia Pacific. So the Solomon Islands is the first island, hoping to expand also to the other islands, and we're working also with the Solomon Island National University on this project. That's me.
What a busy person, as are all of our panelists. Very, very good. Thank you so much, Alice, Stephanie, Taylor, and Tiziana, for introducing yourselves and your very, very broad areas of research, which is pertinent to what we're going to talk about today. We only have until 3 o'clock to have this conversation. There are so many things we could discuss, but let's dive in, see how far we get with our conversation. So I'm going to zoom in onto you first, Alice, and ask you your thoughts on the following. And this is when we examine consumption. When we examine consumption, consumer behaviour is very significant as an element of how all types of resources are valued and flow in economies, particularly in the linear economy with this very fast and ultra fast fashion, but also as we transition our clothing and textiles in a more circular economy. What are some of the big issues you see in this space? Is the focus on durability wrong-headed? Is that not the issue? What do you see? What do you think?
Oh, thanks, Colleen. And I've got a study I can share that we developed last year with colleagues at RMIT. And I think that study on Australians, and I know there's a lot of people on the call from across the Asia Pacific, our study, though, looked at Australian consumer practices in how they acquire, use and care, and then dispose of their clothing. And I think there's actually some quite interesting insights that can shed light on what you're asking about those key issues. So I guess to kind of give you a bit of context, this is a nationally weighted survey. So we had about 3,000 people participate. It's weighted across age, gender, and geographical location. So we can have a fair degree of confidence in that this is representative of what Australians say they do in terms of their clothing practices. So I'll just pull out a couple of key things that I think are really important for thinking about circularity. So the first one I don't think will be a big surprise. Australians are pretty confused about where and how to responsibly discard of their clothing. And by that, I mean both the wearable clothing and the unwearable. So I'll give you an example. 32% of Australians will throw wearable clothes in the general waste bin and 24% in the home recycling bins at least half the time. In other words, there's perfectly good clothing going into the red lid bin and the recycling bin, kind of a wish cycling as people refer to it, because of course the clothing won't be recycled if you put it in the recycling bin. So that's definitely a communication piece. There's also unwearable clothing going in the recycling bin, unwearable clothing going to charities, basically a lot of confusion about the correct pathways. There are some positives though. So Australians are really great at donation, really good at donating to charity, with about 87% that being their preferred path for unwanted clothing. Another positive that we can celebrate is that we buy more secondhand clothing than comparable countries. So 18% of Australians, their last item was in a secondhand item. That might not seem a lot, but in Europe it's far less. And in one example, Italy, it was 5%, for example. So we obviously have more of a culture of purchasing secondhand, which is good for circularity. Another thing we're doing really well is around our laundering practices. So we're line drying, we're washing full loads, we're apparently reading care labels. We're actually using less energy in our laundering than other high consumption countries. So interesting things. The other interesting thing I'd like to highlight though is that while we looked across age, gender and geography, the biggest difference in practices was actually age. So younger Australians, they're far more likely to buy secondhand, to repair, to resell and to share clothes, but they do tend to have large collections of unused clothing. So things they're doing well, things to improve. We see that older Australians, they're far more likely to donate clothing that they don't want. So they've got good donation practices, but they almost never, or far less likely to buy secondhand. So again, different strengths in each different group. And I'll share a link in the chat to a bit of to the report and to the different personas of Australians we found. But coming to the question about durability, I would like to talk a bit more about that, if I may. So when we look at the number one reason why Australians dispose of their clothes, and that's by disposal, I mean it's simply leaving their regular use. Disposal might be diverting to charity, it might be putting in the bin, or it might be putting in the back of their cupboard, lying dormant. The number one reason is that 83% are saying that more than half the time they dispose of garments because they don't fit or they're uncomfortable. In other words, they're probably perfectly usable as a garment, perfectly wearable, but they don't fit that person. So there's a fit challenge there. The next two reasons are related to physical durability. So they're saying the garment's damaged or it's stained or it's worn. So perfectly good reasons to dispose of it. The fourth reason though, and this is 64% disposing of their garments more than half of the time because it doesn't suit their style. So what that really shows us is that durability is a concern. In other words, how worn a garment is and how long it will last is an issue. However, fit is a big issue, and also that kind of more style related issue. So I flag this because there's other studies around the world that are also highlighting something similar, that only looking narrowly at durability, yes, let's make these more durable items, kind of misses the point in that we also need to be looking at durability of garments, but also how do we encourage other responsible practices, acquiring less, acquiring secondhand before new, that kind of thing. So yeah, I thought some of those were quite interesting findings, and I can put some links in the chat to some of that research as well.
It's an important piece of research, given that consumers hold so much power to change the resources that we purchase in our whole economy. So it's a powerful piece of research, and some of what I'm hearing rings true for what I'm observing in my little corner, and even for my practices that are changing. So I want to follow on from that and share this shirt that I'm wearing today. I bought it 3 hours ago. I arrived in this town of Bega, and there was a special second-hand shop called the Green Queen. And I went in, and there were all these beautiful items of clothing that the owner is encouraging people to buy secondhand. But her business model is people sell her 2 items of clothing from their wardrobe, and then they get a return to take 1 item of clothing from what is in the shop. That business model is very interesting to encourage people to consume less by having less in their wardrobe. So it fits in with what you're observing with large collections with the younger generation. There's a lot to unpack around consumer behaviour. What do we do with the long-lasting polyester clothes that have already been made, for example? So I think everyone on the call is probably going to dive into some of your highlights, and first of all, celebrate that Australia is really taking the bull by the horns and reusing our clothes much more than many other countries. Even today, I'm wearing a reused top that normally a year ago, I would never have worn a reused top probably. So the shift, the transition is very exciting. So thank you very much for sharing that. There's so many more questions that I think we can talk about, perhaps even in a follow-up session. We're going to shift to where we are. So place-based approaches, country-centered approaches. And I'm going to come to you, Stephanie, about the idea of country-centered approaches in caring for and connecting to country, which is kind of wisdom from the past that is very relevant today as we're trying to close the loop faster and better. So when it comes to fibre and textiles, particularly consumption, inviting you to share what your research and your practice is revealing. Are we taking too much? Probably yes. What are you thinking in that research space? Are we not addressing overconsumption? Over to you.
Well, care for country is care for each other, and therefore care for future generations and for the landscape and for the planet itself. So, sorry. So yeah, it's all just that the whole concept of circular economy, it just really resonates with Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing and all the things. And yeah, so it's not necessarily just from the past, it's also past, present, and future, just ways. So Indigenous ways of knowing has always adapted as the landscape adapts. So it's very dynamic. Culture's dynamic, always going to change as the landscape changes, because it's very reliant on knowledge that's held within country, and so it might sound woo-woo to some people, but country speaks. So in ways that country speaks, it's kind of like the way that we see change of seasons, for example, that you can see that like the weather gets cooler as we're going into winter, and right now it's quite windy where I am at least, and and the Gaimea lilies are starting to flower, so that means that the whales are starting to make their journey up the coast. So that's ways that country is speaking to us. So the way that things change over time, and the actions and the actions of country essentially is how country speaks. And that's something that Indigenous knowledge systems have always known. So that knowledge is held within the landscape as it shifts, as well as the way that things stay the same, like the mountain and all those things that have always been there. And so bringing it into my research, I'm looking at colour from country. So it's even though it may not necessarily be traditional practices that have been done for since the beginning of time, this is so natural dye making by like boiling up the leaves, for example, with eucalyptus. That's my favorite thing to work with. It's particularly I've been working with eucalyptus that produces really, really bright orangey red colors, and that to me as an artist, is very significant, and especially the way that the dye changes throughout the year, like depending on where you are, the dye is going to be different. So different with the different landscape, and also the time of year, like at different times of year, the color is more vibrant than others. And that's just to do with the composition of the dye, that it's extracted from the plant through the boiling process. And sorry, and this process is country speaking, in that it's saying that there's it's producing different chemicals at different times of year. So more concentrated, the dye component is more concentrated when it's really hot. So that's something that I found from my art making practice, as well as through working with that dye in the lab as well. And that's not something, like, it's been a while since the world has worked with natural dyes, like particularly in textiles, and that's mostly due to reproducibility issues. And yeah, because a lot of mass production of materials, they want things to be the same every single time they make it. They want it to be the same. But that's the beauty of working with natural dyes. It's actually that it is country speaking and saying what is happening with country at that particular moment in time that you're making the dye. So that kind of flips that idea of needing to have things be reproducible on its head, that it's like, it's actually really important and culturally affirming to be able to work with country in that way, that it can communicate to us in that way. And yeah, so it's really slowing down that process of making, to be aware of the materials that we're using, and that process of even at the start, before I even make the dye, just going to harvest materials, have to walk on country, observe what's there, not take too much, take only what's needed, and not take everything that's there, because you want to leave some for country to use in natural processes. So that's slowing it down, being present with country, learning from country at the same time. And also the process of making in culture has always been a very big community building aspect of knowledge sharing and generating and just being together. And so that, to me, is a really important thing to bring into all of this, that it can be like, slowing things down in this way can be very feel really good for everybody involved. So you're mindful as well as building community in the same process. And so yeah, I haven't worked much with looking specifically how it fixes onto dye, but that's something that I'm interested in into the future, like the dye fixes onto fabric. But from my experience as an artist, like eucalyptus, you don't need anything to make it fix onto the fabric. Like, it just has its own mordant built in. So that mixture, the relationships within that mixture, everything works to produce that color, and for us to be able to take care of that color after the object has been dyed, after the fiber's been dyed, and into the future as well, for us to use it and bring country with us as we wear the objects, or take it with us wherever we go. So those sort of cultural values are embedded into my art making practice, and I've been expanding that practice into actually sewing my own clothes with things that I dye. And I didn't have any good examples to show you today, but I was thinking also about how there's so many Indigenous designers and makers out there who are making, like in particular fashion, in the fashion industry, they are making items of clothing that are that have community and cultural knowledge embedded within it. So it's the voice of country is able to come through what the what the item is saying in itself. Like, there's lots of communities out there that are screen printing their own designs onto fabric that is then used by different companies to make clothes. And so those stories that are embedded into those fabrics are just really significant in educating others about the values of care and slowing it down and the ethics of caring for country. So it's advocating for country with what you wear. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. So I don't know if you can see it or if it's flipped, but yeah, it's sovereign land, Aboriginal land, and that's from Clothing the Gaps. And they have so many clothing items that do advocate for country and for people, and but they're very careful, they're mindful about where it comes from and who's making it and what the fabric is. So yeah, that's just an example of ways that Indigenous Australia are working with the times but also caring for country and advocating for country.
Wow, Stephanie, that kind of current practice and wisdom about slowing down is probably giving people a lot of additional deep thoughts. For me, it's sparking the concept of meaning in colour, and the idea that changing colour from the place that it comes from and understanding the meaning connection from that item that has a unique colour from a particular place takes our cognitive and kind of emotional depth in what we're wearing to a much more profound level. And I guess we can have lots of deeper conversations about how that can manifest and inspire us to do things differently, rather than it has to be cobalt blue exactly, or in Devil Wears Prada, you have to have last season's cerulean blue coming through that's the same in all collections. Oh, such brilliant food for thought. Wow. I'm going to go beyond the use phase now and look at the end of life of items, particularly around recycling. So we know that recycling in the transition to the circular economy, particularly in clothing and textiles, has received proportionately the largest amount of attention in these early phases of circular economy transition, textiles, plastics, and so forth. We're seeing very significant amounts of infrastructure investment and legislative commitment, for example, across the globe for recycling textile fibres. In Vietnam, we see H&M investing extremely heavily. I'm coming to you, Taylor. Where is recycling up to with respect to closing the loop on resource flow in the fibre and textile space? For example, with extending product lifetime. Love to hear your thoughts on this one.
Perfect. Thank you, Colleen, for the introduction. Yeah, so recycling really has received a significant and growing share of attention in the transition for a circular economy. Like you said, we're seeing investment, and we're also seeing new legislative commitments to support the expansion of textile recycling. So in the EU, we're seeing the mandating of separate collection of textiles and member states introducing extended producer responsibility schemes. And here, like Alice was involved with, Australia's product stewardship scheme, Seamless, while it is still voluntary, is looking to shift 60% of clothing textiles away from landfill. I think we are seeing lots of innovation as well. But for example, fiber-to-fiber recycling is moving from that pilot phase increasingly towards commercial scales, with promising advances in chemical recycling as well as enzyme-based fiber breakdown. And we're also seeing progress with respect to digital product passports, which will give recyclers more clarity and precise data on material content, which is needed to improve sorting and recovery. However, I think despite this momentum, recycling is still not closing the loop. We've heard the stat before that less than 1% of clothing textiles is turned into new textiles. Really, most is downcycled into rags or insulation at this point. And there's also a lot of trade-offs that are being negotiated in existing recycling technology. For example, mechanical recycling weakens fibers, while chemical methods, while they are promising, they also are quite economically, they're expensive, and they're also really energy intensive. And I think as recycling scales, we need to consider what we're recycling and whether it's safe. So I mentioned our current project is in considering the toxic legacy of plastic-based textiles. So according to the European Environmental Agency, up to 3,500 substances are used in textile production. Of that, 750 have been identified as hazardous to human health. And there's another 400 or so that are seen as environmentally harmful. So we do see that textile recycling is gaining momentum as is key strategy in this transition to a circular economy. We also need to recognize the uncertainty, potential risks around chemical safety of recycled materials. And as we're looking to scale up these processes to manage growing waste streams, there's a real risk that these chemicals may persist or inadvertently be introduced during recycling processes. So thanks to some of the colleagues I have here who are experts in this field, some of the examples of the chemicals that we might be looking at are flame retardants, which have been linked to hormone disruption and neurotoxicity, UV stabilizers, which persist in the environment. There's also legacy chemicals, so chemicals that have been banned now, but might be found in those op-shop clothes from once upon a time when they were being used. And then there's residues from use, so optical brighteners from detergents as a key example there. So we run the risk if recycling is perpetuating this chemical contamination, we may be turning a circular solution into more of a toxic loop. And we're hoping that as our project unfolds over the next 2 years, we can inform safer practices for recyclers, manufacturers, and stewardship schemes like Seamless, so we can ensure that a circular economy is also a safe one. But I think still kind of taking a step back, even if and when we solve this chemical challenge, I think another issue looms, and that's around volumes. The fashion system really is designed around overproduction and overconsumption, with ultra-fast fashion brands like Shein and Temu releasing hundreds, if not thousands, of styles daily. But we also know as we're purchasing more clothing, we're actually keeping it for shorter amounts of time. And of course, we see this here in Australia, where the average consumer is purchasing 53 new items a year, and at the same time, over 220,000 tons of textile waste went to landfill in 2023. In the EU, we see the figure of around 16 kg of textile waste per person per year being generated, with approximately 4.4 kg being collected for reuse or recycling. So I think while recycling is essential, of course, it is a back-end fix to what's very much a front-end problem. And so how do we think about this runaway production and shrinking wear time? So I think there's here at ISF and others are really thinking about what's the processes that we need to start to close the loop and how to slow it down. And that's things like designing for durability, repairability, and recyclability. I think increasingly thinking through how we regulate ultra and fast fashion. Is that eco-modulated fees? Is that advertising restrictions? There's also been talks around import controls or even all-out bans. And then to your question, how do we extend product life? Thinking about rental, resale, and repair. And I think if we're going to be scaling any of these alternatives, there's really a need to be that supportive policy, infrastructure, and environment. So that could include tax breaks for secondhand purchases. It could investment in local repair and reuse hubs, and also public education around textile waste and how we as consumers and citizens can make more circular choices. For example, there was polling last year that showed over 60% of Australians would be interested in repairing clothes more often if rebates were available, where currently that stat for who's repairing is under 40%. So we see that while there might be there is in kind of growing strong interest around thinking about how we can participate in the circular economy, we do need that policy and market alignment to make these options more viable, and particularly economically viable. So I think kind of wrapping up there, if we do see recycling, of course, as part of the solution, it very much isn't the silver bullet. The loop isn't going to close if we just keep accelerating production and reducing our wear times. So thinking through how circularity really is tied to that slowing the loop, not just closing it. And I think that also requires us to rethink what we allow to circulation in the first place, whether that can be materially or stylish, also the chemicals, and also socially, how we're valuing our clothes. So when we are thinking where we're up to currently in terms of closing the loop, it's not just about the technology and infrastructure. Of course, that is really important. In Australia, we're going to see how that's going to unfold over the coming weeks and years with Seamless. But still, it's about volume, it's about design, it's about chemical safety, regulation, and kind of the broader social cultural systems that shape what we wear and how we value it. Leave it there for now.
Oh, thank you so much, Taylor. It's a wealth of knowledge that you've shared there, and some really profound ties too with the speed of which we're moving in this space in particular, and what Stephanie was talking about in terms of what country is doing and generating and how we view it. yeah, the recycling piece really does tie into what goes back into our bodies and goes back into the environment. If there are reports that you're happy to share that with your research in the chat or any links, we welcome that, because I think many of us are hungry to know more. We're going to go to Tiziana now and invite her to provide some of her reflections on product service systems and consumption. We know that this is sort of quite central to whole value chains, particularly so in the fibre and textile value chain. So Tiziana, I'm going to ask you what product service elements you see as important for fibre and textiles in the circular economy. You know, are there particular consumer groups that are to blame for overconsumption? Are gendered stereotypes coming in here for this complex problem, for example, or are there other significant elements? Over to you, Tiziana.
Thank you, Colleen. And yes, there are two parts in your question. So I start from product service systems. And what I'd like to say is the service-based systems per se do not take sustainable forms. However, they are fundamental, for example, in third and fourth world, because they remain a precondition for sustainable development, but they start getting ambiguous when it comes to fashion and textiles. So the thing is, for example, just to give an example, that those clothes that have been rented many times and washed many times then end up in the line of second-hand clothing, and we know what happens to second-hand clothing that are sorted, resorted, and ultimately then sent to the third, fourth world. So the PSS shifts the focus from selling products to selling a system of products, so from ownership to rental, which should satisfy the consumer needs and demands. And I'll see in the second part how that probably does not satisfy completely the consumer needs and demands that are also very cultural. Rental obviously is useful in slowing down the cycle of buying, the cycle of using virgin resources, but should also be designed with in mind the life cycle design strategies in the first place. So we need long-lasting clothing, which should be made with materials, fibers that are of high quality. Polyester obviously lasts a very long time, but then we know what down the line, we are in midstream here, the user phase, and then downstream what happens with polyester. So natural fibers of high quality, clothing has to be designed with circularity in mind, and materials must be easily reused, replaced, recycled, or also designed with modularity in mind. And of course, those clothes need to be produced ethically. So the models that we can think about in rental within the circular economy paradigm can be swap shops, fashion libraries, and fashion renting. Fashion renting, these are more business oriented. They're all part of service economies, and we see that extending the product life is the priority here for the minimum use of all the materials. So on paper, PSS in fashion is a good thing, but the system, those online national global fashion websites, the system is focused on optimization of business models, such as looking at operational costs and digital innovation. And typically renting platforms rest within our economic system. So renting clothes is predicated on scale and efficiency. Again, they are online, and they rely on transportation. And here is just one impact and one effect of renting clothes, is that in the long term, transportation has an environmental impact and doesn't make this system sustainable in the long term. So for me, local fashion libraries move more clearly, also because maybe I'm focused on local economy, local circular communities. The local fashion libraries are more clearly in the direction of sustainable PSS. They are readily accessible, create networks amongst users, increase social connection and well-being. And they are particularly, they could have been used, and they could be particularly successful with the children's clothes. When I was in Honiara, I saw how much children clothes arrive from Australia and how much is an important thing also in that local economy, because obviously children, grow continuously, and so clothing within local communities, childcares in a neighborhood and in a city at the urban level, but also regional level, are much more successful, in my opinion. And here I come to the second part of the question, which is about consumers. So there are barriers in rental because they counter the emotional see now, buy now impulse that consumers can satisfy through online purchases. So to rent clothing, one has to be engaged with the practice, has to think about what to buy, rent it, wait to arrive, wear it, return it on time, eventually wash it, unless the platform supplies this kind of service. So that degree of engagement denies the hedonistic, on-the-moment pleasure of shopping for clothing, because we know that fashion is more than fashion. It's also identity, self-identity, it's change, it's self-expression. So there is, we're dealing here with cultural, social, and contextual elements and stereotypes. And what is interesting is that we have always talked about the consumers and the consumer, which in English doesn't have a gender. So we know that consumers are typically women. Consumers of fashion are typically women. And implicitly, when we look at policies that always talk about consumer, again, in a genderless way, consumer behavior and educating the consumer, it is the women that need to be educated and need to be, and their behavior needs to be changed. So also for rental platforms, it is talked in the literature about, changing the practice and changing the behavior of consumers. So women, what I'm also working on in this space at the moment about policy and women, they are the center of fashion in multiple ways, as underpaid laborers, hyper-consumers, and the ones tasked with the burden of mending and repairing clothing to care for the planet. And when I talk about burden, is that it all comes a little bit too much, right? So within circularity and sustainability in the 21st century, the practices that slow consumption are targeted to those who are blamed for hyperconsumption and unsustainability of a system. And here is my, what I put there on the table, is a system that is inherently based on environmental and social exploitation. So to conclude, what I like to say is the entire fashion system and its commodities carry gendered connotations in every domain, from production to consumption to sustainability actions. And what I like to do is draw attention to the need to create a systematic and systemic response that is local and networked with other local realities through social relations. That's done.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. You've covered two very big topics and big questions and blended them together very beautifully. I think there might be a collective sigh on the call here of thinking consumers, women, are used to generate this linear economy in some ways, and yet now we have to also fix it. I'm looking at the panelists here, and I can almost bet to look at the demographics of the people who are fully engaged. But gender is part of a very bigger system of power, and who is in power is also critical for the circular economy change. I feel like across our four panelists, we've got so much to discuss in this session. I'm going to engage now and ask some questions in the chat. We've got 6 minutes left for our panel discussion today. So the first one that I can see in the Q&A is thank you to the panel members for sharing their insights. Specifically, incentives for second-hand purchases, stewardship schemes, and consumer behaviours attitude was engaging. A broad question, but I was wondering if you could provide some best case examples of what is happening in the APAC region for textile circularity and how Australia in particular can learn from them. And that can go to anyone on the panel. Is there anyone on the panel who'd like to pick up that question?
I suppose I could jump in there to say that, you know, thinking about where recycling, for example, is happening at present, we can see throughout India, mechanical recycling, particularly in places like Panipat and Tirupur, is very well established. We're also seeing new recycling hubs formed in other parts of Asia as well, like we've heard recently about the new hub in Malaysia with Samsara that's being established, as I understand it. So that's on the kind of, you know, if we have Asia is the manufacturing powerhouse, Asia can be the remanufacturing powerhouse as well on the industrial front. On the, I guess, cultural side, I can see that there's so many incredible practices across the Asia Pacific. And I know we've got a number of colleagues on the call from Vietnam, for example, where there's incredible traditional textiles there. If we think of Indonesia, if we think of what Stephanie shared about learning from and listening to country, we're also seeing that across our region. And, you know, the industrial side of fashion production pays little attention to those practices that are, I guess, embedded in people and embedded in place. And I think that's something that we can all learn from and celebrate across our region as well as here in Australia.
Thank you very much, Alice. Is there anyone else on our panel who would like to pick up any comments there? Nope. Okay. We have 4 minutes left, so I'll go to the next question I can see on my screen. This question, I think, is directed at Alice. I see from the op shops that due to cheaper price of the products, people are buying more and sometimes unnecessarily. In my understanding, the circular business model ultimately encourages people to buy more, which is known as the circular economy rebound effect. What do you think about it, and how do you think we can deal with this issue? And the person who asked the question is Mithun Biswas. Apologies if I mispronounced.
Thanks for the question, Mithun. And I think this it's a superb point, because the rebound effect is well established, also known as Jevons paradox, this idea that when you make improvements, paradoxically, you end up using more of a resource by improving its efficiency. So what it highlights to me is that when we say a circular economy, we need to be really clear about what kind of circular economy we're talking about. Is it one that's more efficient? because, and that's often how the Australian government is framing it, a more efficient circular economy will actually just have resources churn through faster and faster, which ultimately will not support the goals that we have. Rather, we should look to a circular economy that is just and that is sufficient. In other words, that we're happy with enough, we're delighted with having enough. And that's, I think, requires a whole other paradigm shift in thinking about what is enough as well. Unmute, Colleen.
All right. Thank you so much. The concept of sufficiency is very critical to this conversation and economics in itself. I'm going to just open the floor to Tiziana, Taylor, or Stephanie if you want to comment, and then we'll wrap up.
One comment to Alice. Sorry, I feel a little bit picked on Italy not consuming enough second-hand clothing. And what I want to say is that Italy, I didn't check it now, I knew this, throw away 16 kilograms of clothing per person. So that's about 9 kilograms less than Australia. And in fact, Italy is one of the least wasting country for food and clothing in Europe. One thing, but the other thing is also that second-hand shops are not so available in Italy like in Australia, where basically we have them everywhere, in every region, in every little town, there are charities, and in Italy there are only commercial, and in fact the collection of second-hand clothing is done by agencies, not charities. So there's a completely different system or institutional system. Yes, sorry, I wanted just to make a little bit a point on the fact that second-hand clothing is very cultural, the buying, and it's so, for example, as far as I know, for some Asian societies is not something that people would do, buying second-hand clothing. Yeah, I was just feeling like that probably we have data that encourage us, and that's really great. But on the other end, we're also buying a lot of clothing, and so we are churning through very quickly. That's just a point of reflection.
Thank you, Tiziana. We do have Ben Kaminsky who has asked one question, so I'm going to quickly see if there's anyone who'd like to briefly answer it. When it comes to the Pacific, the tyranny of distance presents a profound challenge, making on-island recycling capabilities not just important but essential. Is there any work currently being undertaken by the United Nations to support establishment of such facilities?
I'm not sure, but it sounds like a great research gap that we should be, looking into in more detail.
That term on island is very relevant to Australia for our place, isn't it? Okay, Ben, you've raised a challenge for us, a research question that must be answered. All right, we've come to time for our 1 hour together today. I want to say a very big thank you to the panelists who have taken time to prepare the questions and the concept for part 2 session, and also then sharing and discussing with us today their reflections on closing the loop on fibres and textiles. So thank you very much, Alice, Stephanie, Taylor and Tiziana. It's a pleasure working with you. Thank you, Alston, in the background for making this tech possible, and Saniat Islam as the co-chair of the textile stream of CERN APAC, along with Alice. And thank you to everyone who joined today. We had 45 people join, which is just marvellous. And if you're watching online after this, we hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Let's keep closing the gap. Thank you. Bye. Okay.